Hi, I'm Colin.
And I'm Phil.
We're the hosts of Science Fiction 101.
It's a show which gets to the heart of science fiction. Books, films, TV. We've covered Star Trek,
Doctor Who,
Star Wars.
We love to explore the past, present, and future of science fiction.
And we'd love for you to join us
on Science Fiction 101.
Hi, Colin.
Hi, Phil.
We're recording this at the end of March 2026. And what's our main topic going to be today, Colin?
I came across an essay by Dr. Ada Palmer called Why All Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Are Historians. And I thought it would be cool to read that, think about it, perhaps find other similar related or controverting things, and see where the discussion goes.
Sure. So an essay review coming up.
Yeah.
There may also be a quiz later, so watch this space. Just before that, some comments on recent episodes from our listeners. On the topic of the apparently older demographic of the contributors to Asimov's magazine, we have some confirmation. Bob wrote in saying, your observation on the age of authors is spot on. I, in a 2024 issue, so he's been published in the magazine, am 70, and I notice many authors are older, including one recent one who died in his 90s before his last sale came out.
Oh.
The magazine still wins awards, but you have to worry, he says. So, wow. Linda also commented on our Asimov's episode. She said, on the subject of priests in space, I've read so many of Ray Bradbury's Martian stories that it feels completely natural to me to bring a priest along on a voyage to a strange, deserted planet. I might even go so far as to say I wouldn't leave without one. So thank you, Linda. Damo praised Greg Egan, who was one of the authors we mentioned in that episode. He calls Greg Egan one of the best writers in modern SF. The way he deals with science and especially mathematics and integrates those concepts into stories involving real people is beyond compare. And Sue wrote, it's really lucky that some alien civilizations have technology similar to ours, like in that story Solemnity. We would have been in some deep doo-doo if the Apple that the Independence Day guys used to deliver the computer virus hadn't been compatible. Phew, says Sue. So thank you, Sue. And on the subject of time travel, we had a comment from Rock who said The Time Tunnel 1966 was a seminal US TV show that deserved a mention. And funny you should mention that because I'm going to mention Time Tunnel later. Linda says, when you touched on the subject of non-tech time travel, I thought of Jack Finney. Though his characters don't exactly use science to travel in time, it's very methodical. There's nothing dreamlike about it, and it can often go wrong. And then she says, good job on the quiz, Colin. I was rooting for you all the way.
Thanks, Linda. And
Sue then added, let me gush about Linda's quiz. What fun. I got 13 out of 16, one more than Colin. Practically impossible. I'm chuffed. No, not British, just chuffed. So thank you, Sue.
So do you think that people are taking these quizzes in parallel with us and comparing their scores to ours every time?
Possibly.
Oh, I do get a monthly report from Seth about how he does on these quizzes.
Excellent. I mean, they're there for people to join in with, so I'm pleased to hear that people are actually joining in. But if they're anything like me, they probably shout at the smart speaker as they're doing the quiz. You know, they shout the answers and argue with it when it's wrong.
Why don't you know this? Why don't you?
Yeah. Anyway, if you'd like to join in the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Post a comment on our blog at 101sf.blogspot.com. or find us as Science Fiction 101 Podcast on Facebook and on Blue Sky. And now on to our main topic.
Why all science fiction and fantasy writers are historians. This was published in the current issue of the online magazine Strange Horizons, and I mentioned it's by Dr. Ada Palmer. And one of the things that a friend of mine told me that I should do years, literally decades ago, is when you read something online, whether it's fiction or not, you should learn a little bit about the person. And so it turns out that Ada Palmer is actually an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago, and she has a doctorate. And so my first thought was, obviously, she's broadcasting her biases and worldview into this idea about what science fiction authors are or aren't. But as I read the essay itself, I was persuaded otherwise. I don't think I'm there 100%, and I think there might be a couple of edge cases, which
Yeah.
she does. She covers some edge cases of her own. But this idea that all science fiction and fantasy authors are historians.
And it is a bold claim because that's the actual title of the piece, isn't it? It's not why science fiction and fantasy writers are historians, it's why all are historians. Maybe there's some truth to it, but I was instantly skeptical.
Yeah.
And I have to say, because this is an essay, it makes me instinctively reach for my red pen, which is what I would use if I were marking a student essay. Some of our listeners may be put off the idea of reading an essay, but this is quite a short essay. It's quite an easy read.
We bought a new car last night, and I knew I was going to be stuck in a car dealership for hours. So I printed it off and brought it with me, and I was marking it up like you were talking about. I think
Yeah.
it's 4 pages. It's a 15 or 20-minute read, but it's very thought-provoking.
Yeah. I don't know if you said, though, but she is also a science fiction writer. So she's not just a historian.
Yeah. When we reviewed stories for the Hugos last year, we read another science fiction piece, Three Faces of a Beheading, by Arcady Martin, who I'm almost positive is a historian.
Oh, yes.
It was well written, not my favorite story, but this whole concept of history and playing history and experiencing history through various characters was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think, if anything, what Ada Palmer's article does is present a case for science fiction and historical fiction as being two facets of the same thing. So I think that's an interesting. Well, it's not exactly a discovery that the essay makes, but it's something that it throws up that the reader may not have particularly thought about previously.
Yeah.
So even if we don't 100% agree with the main claim that all science fiction writers are historians, we can at least see that there is some commonality between science fiction and historical fiction. Shall we go through some of the detail of the essay?
Yeah.
I don't know how detailed you want to be with it.
Oh, I think for purpose of discussion, we could break it down into several big chunks.
Okay.
In fact, I want to bring up the point you just made about science fiction and historical fiction further on in that discussion.
Sure. I think the first thing that leaps out from the essay is Ada Palmer's attempt to correctly frame what it is that historians do. So she begins by saying, we tend to think that historians just assemble facts, but what they actually do is more like what a particle physicist does, which isn't just talk about static particles, but look at how things interact, how they move. And that's really what historians do. They don't just look at things that are static, they are looking at change and how one thing causes another. And you can theorize in history just as you can theorize in science.
Yeah, there's an establishing of cause and effect. And when I read that, initially, I thought about the history of pottery, how people
Okay.
will track how this pottery is from this time, and then as the technology of pottery developed and the source materials changed, they could say, oh, now they know that glazing pottery extends the lifespan, and then there were artistic things you could put onto the pottery, and so through the history of the art of the pottery, you could date it, and looking at what they valued and what they would put on there would tell you much more than you would understand it if you only looked at the pottery in situ without everything else around it.
The other thing that I'm sort of aware of in terms of what historians do, from having read a lot of Stephen Jay Gould, who was an evolutionary biologist, he used to talk a lot about historical sciences. And he would usually put those two terms together, that history is a science. You may have objects, you may have artifacts, but you come up with theories about them. You hypothesize in exactly the same way that a scientist does. And then you use the hypothesis to generate predictions. So, okay, we found this thing in the ground. We hypothesize that it is used for X, Y, and Z. If it is used for X, Y, and Z, then we would expect also to see A, B, and C. So we go looking for A, B, and C. And if we don't find A, B, and C, hypothesis is contradicted. So we go back and we reconsider the hypothesis. So history is scientific in the way that it progresses.
You could even take it to the point of trade, where you could say, oh, there's now the color blue showing up in the artwork on the pottery, and there's never been a blue dye here before. So did they establish trade with someone with a blue dye, and then to go to that location and say, well, do they have things from this location, which would establish the fact that trade had been happening back and forth. And so it not only extends to technology, commerce, and exploration, and religion, and all these various things that are all looked at through the lens of the way things used to be, what we call history.
Yeah. One thing she doesn't do, at least I don't think she does this, she doesn't really talk about future history, which is one thing that science fiction can be quite well known for. There are certain science fiction writers who do that, they project the future. And I don't think she really talks about that, except in this global sense of all science fiction being historical.
Yeah, later in the essay, she talks about centers of power and users of power, and how
Yes.
that tends to be a cyclical thing that happens again and again. So I think a good historian, when writing future science fiction, would say there might be changes to some parts, but this idea that there's humans with power and how they use it and how it might be encouraged or opposed, that I think that stays constant.
Yes, that's interesting. She talks about historical change. She talks about historians making arguments as to the causes of changes. And incidentally, I saw a thing this week. This is a bit abstruse if you're not British, but apparently I think he's a historian, made a declaration this week that there's something in the year 1066, something to do with the Battle of Hastings, is not how we've always thought it to be. In the year 1066, you've got the King of England. He goes off to the north of England to fight off a Viking invasion. He sees off the Vikings, and then within minutes of completing that, he now has to go all the way from the north of England right down to the south coast of England because William the Conqueror has just landed in Hastings and has invaded England. So he's just seen off one attack in the north. Now he's got to head down and see off another attack in the south. And historians have always believed that he had to travel across land. It's hundreds of miles, and that he had to travel across land in a very short period of time. But this historian has said, oh, wait a minute, we can reinterpret this document here, and it may be that he came by sea. So it may have still been a rush, but it was more stately. He just got on a boat and sailed around the outside. Now, not all historians are accepting this, but it's interesting that you can still come up with new theories based on old stuff. This guy did this by reinterpreting existing historical documents. That was a bit long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, I think that exactly bolsters the claim about the development of history like a science.
Yes.
For hundreds of years, it was established that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then they reinterpreted information they had already seen and said, well, no, things aren't going curly-Q around us. We're all going in circles together around something else. And that explains our observations much more eloquently.
Yes. And I think we'll come to that later, won't we? Because we have a bit of Galileo coming up in a while.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. It reminds me from the essay, her discussion about what historians do at conferences. Argue about the beginning of end of certain eras and whether those eras exist, and this topic and that topic. And that reminds me of a science fiction convention where people talk about the merits of an author or a work, or introduce people to new things they hadn't thought about before.
Yeah. Well, having established what it is that historians do and what history is, she then goes into her discussion of science fiction. She says, in brief, the historian's craft aims to show how our world changes and who or what has the power to change it. And then she says, okay, in SFF, the world usually changes. It may be saved, destroyed, discovered, overrun by zombies, driven mad by fairies, terraformed, irradiated, touched by strangers, or saved from tyrants, but it changes. And that's therefore her connection between science fiction and historians.
Well, first of all, I think it's a delightful sentence. She writes very well. Not only did I like the subject matter, but the process of reading it was very engaging and enjoyable, because she doesn't just say, oh, it's future science fiction, or it's only epic fantasy. She's saying that if people are going to write accurate depictions of fantastical things, you're going to root them in reality. And so often we think of that as, oh, well, you're going to do Western fantasy in a British kind of setting with elves and gnomes, or you're going to do near term science fiction with highly accurate science. No, the real meat is how well you take anything and inject it into a world and then evolve it around that in ways that are realistic to the world through a historical lens.
Yeah. And that focus on the idea of change is not new. I mean, for a long time, people have been pointing out that what differentiates science fiction from normal fiction is that it is always posited on some point of difference from the real world. And it might be a discovery in science that is different from what we know from real science. It might be some event that occurs. It could be the arrival of a flying saucer, but it's something that changes our world into the fictional world, and then the story is off and running. So she's not making a new claim here, but I think what is the newness of it is this linkage to, this is what historians do, and this is what science fiction writers do.
Well, not a new subgenre, but I think a subgenre that has become very popular recently is romantasy. And in a romantasy, there is still this idea of a separate world, but the focus is not on fixing the problem or saving the world or stopping the dictator. The interest is about the relationship between two or sometimes more people. And she said, in romantasy, for example, sometimes nothing is at stake more or larger than the happiness and intimate lives of the characters. And so those romantasies can have a world built which makes claims about history, but might have a very light world build.
I mean, I've not actually read any romantasy, not knowingly anyway, but I sort of recognize it from the description because I've heard other people refer to it. But I get a bit uncomfortable when exceptions are made. Why are you making an exception when you just said that this is categorically true of all, and now you're saying, oh yeah, but not this?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a rejection of romantasy or other similar subgenres from that description. I think it's more a change of the focus of the plot.
Yes.
The world has been built, but
Yeah.
the focus isn't necessarily saving the cheerleader or pushing the aliens back or the invasive plague. The emphasis is about the relationship.
Yes. That's something that I find is true of quite a bit of fantasy and probably some science fiction as well. I tend to be drawn to science fiction that says something, that makes some kind of comment on the world, but I am very aware that there is science fiction which does not make any comment on the world and just presents a new world for the reader or the viewer to wallow in, just for the enjoyment. But the claim at the head of the essay is that all science fiction and fantasy writers are doing this, and you can't have it both ways. It can't be that all are doing it and then some are not. So I think that headline claim is overblown. It's hype.
Yeah, I wonder if it's the original title from the essay or if that's been something editorialized.
Yes, of course, that's a possibility, isn't it? I'm just scrolling back now to see whether she repeats that in the body of the essay. Well, she does, because in paragraph 2, she says, to understand why all SFF writers are historians, you have to understand what a historian does. So it's not just the headline that makes that claim. It is also echoed in paragraph 2 of the essay.
Yeah, even further down, all science fiction and fantasy authors of stories with world building and of stories where the world changes, practice historian's craft. Next sentence. You can find some science fiction and fantasy that doesn't. Romantasy, for example, and then there's that whole development about how it's different. But I would argue that the world building aspect still practices the historian's craft. It's just that the focus isn't about the world. The focus is about a relationship in the world.
That's right.
Now I'm arguing against the essay author.
Yeah. So I suppose it's to do with the degree to which the focus is on this historian aspect within a story. So if you're writing a piece of science fiction which is a parallel world, or is an alternate history, then you're dealing very directly with historical forces. But where you've written a story which is set on some far-flung planet, it may be more that the development of the society reflects something we know from our own history. So it's a different relationship to history.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's about the conflict.
Yeah,
Uh, I'm thinking about Arthur C. Clarke's A Fall of Moon Dust, which
right.
posits that eventually there'll be commercial tourist trips on the moon and a catastrophic thing happens. It's very rooted in science,
Hmm.
but it's not interested in changing the world. It's the conflict between, can we save these people that have fallen into, a crater full of moon dust before they suffocate or overheat?
Yeah, my vague memory of A Fall of Moondust is it's kind of like a disaster movie. It's
Oh
kind of
yeah.
like one of those airplane, no, not airplane, that's the comedy, isn't it? Airport movies from the 70s, or Towering Inferno, or the Poseidon Adventure.
Yes.
It's very similar to that kind of thing. The thing that differentiates it from those is that it's on the moon. So there's your point of novelty, or your point of change, is that we've changed from Earth to Moon. And that brings with it a whole new raft of hazards that you wouldn't have on the Earth. But is that the historian that is then brought out in the writer, or is it the ability to imagine a world which is different to ours, rather than a world which is changed from ours?
The idea that you take a rescue story and put it into a science fiction genre versus how
Hmm.
would the world evolve given that this piece of science or magic or whatever exists.
Yeah. So we're moving towards the possibility that science fiction isn't just doing historian type things. I feel that there's a big scope to science fiction, which certainly encompasses the historian approach, but isn't limited to it.
One thing I immediately, when I read the essay, the beginning of it especially, was wonder why not a sociologist? Why a historian? And I think she makes a pretty good case
Yeah.
for why a historian. So, my history, I went to school and I became an electrical engineer, and my specialty was mixed signal circuit design, which means I did analog and digital. And when you take digital classes, they're focused at people that want to be digital designers. And people put out this idea that the digital designer is a tall, thin man, meaning that you have to have a knowledge of the low level physics and chemistry of the circuits, but also of the extremely high level knowledge of systems and designs. And so you can't specialize in any one area in between.
Yeah.
And I think that describes what she is saying about a historian. A historian cannot be just a researcher in old dusty books. You
Mm.
have to know culture and technology and sociology and anthropology and medicine and all these things. And maybe you can't be a specialist in all of them,
Yeah.
but you need to bring them all there to build the complete picture.
Yeah.
And that's exactly world building.
It is. But I wonder why she wrote this as an article in a science fiction magazine and why she didn't do the opposite, which is to write an article for a historical magazine arguing that all historians are science fiction writers.
Maybe she has. That would be really
Ah,
cool. Right?
could be.
Write the essay and then the inverse essay.
Yeah, yeah.
I think she's maybe covertly, and I might be injecting things into this. At the end of the story, she makes a claim, and it was so incredible I wrote it down. Oh, maybe I didn't write it down. But it's the idea that most people will ingest history through not only historical fiction, but through science fiction and fantasy, because the science fiction and fantasy authors tend to be historians.
Yeah.
And then there's also a side claim made saying that historians aren't focused on figuring out how to alter things in the future. They're focused on an analysis of the past. But when you bring in some other science fiction concepts, like from Fahrenheit 451, if you begin to erase or alter history, you can influence a culture. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the incredible response to Dan Brown's first book, right? Making these claims about Catholicism and Christianity and how people were defensive and how people were offensive. And it's like, it's a fantasy book. It's not real. There's not a lot of historical things to justify it. So why would you get all bent out of shape about this? It's just,
Yeah. Because a lot of stuff presents itself as history, but is not. Well, just as we often talk about Michael Crichton in passing, and a lot of his fiction presents itself as scientific, but is not. But he knew what he was doing. I don't know to what extent Dan Brown knows what he's doing. Probably to the same extent. I don't know.
And he's done his research, and he develops those plots, and the logic that his characters follow is pretty logical. I think there's a bit of Mary Sueism that happens,
Yes, probably.
right?
Yeah. Have you actually read any?
Oh, I've read many of them. They're
Have you?
interesting reads and
Oh,
fun.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he lost me at Inferno, where a majority of the world's population becomes sterilized.
Oh,
But yeah, yeah. And yeah, the other part about controlling history in the future automatically made me think of psychohistory from the Foundation series.
yeah.
So psychohistory works really well for a number of centuries until something pops up that they hadn't anticipated, an
Mm.
evolution. And I
Yep.
won't say more about that for the people that are currently watching the Foundation series or that haven't read the Foundation books yet. But I think it's important to say, it's only making predictions, statistical predictions. There's no absolute control.
Yes.
Sometimes science fiction and any books are just written to entertain. And the claim from, gosh, just over 10 years ago by the Sad and the Rabbit Puppies was that science fiction had all become message fiction, where I think that science fiction has almost always been message fiction, all the way clear back to Frankenstein. And there are interesting diversions, but even in the more entertaining, to coin a phrase, science fiction, The Martian says a lot about what human societies will do, and it's all stated at the end, this understanding that when someone is stuck down a well or stuck on a mountain, communities come together with resources to try and bring that one person down because the individual is still important to the whole and to other people in the community. And that's the big story of The Martian.
It is. And that's a very good analogy, the idea of somebody being stuck down a well, because that's something that does happen in real life and something that can happen in mainstream fiction. And one of the things that this essay claims is that most authors, and this is a quote, most authors of other genres outside SFF are not historians. And that bit made me pause because I'm not sure that that is true. I'm not sure that all SFF writers are historians, and I'm certainly not sure that most authors outside are not historians. Immediately, I thought of, well, what about those who write historical fiction? And then later on, she ties that to science fiction. She sort of almost says, well, they are one and the same. And that made me think, no, you can't do that. It's convenient for your argument for you to say these two things are the same, but they're not the same. So, so I found myself going around in circles with this essay. I like the ethos of it, but there are some things in it that make me say, no, you can't quite argue that.
It's not quite that inclusive. Like,
Yeah.
can you imagine the very, very short story where somebody's 3-year-old daughter falls down a well and nobody tries to rescue her? That lacks historical accuracy. No one's
Yeah.
going, people are going to be outraged about that
Yes.
story.
Yeah.
And so that should be a lesson. That's almost a counter lesson saying, well, yes, historically, we value that person so much we would go get her. So postulating a world where that wouldn't happen, I guess, could be science fiction.
Yeah. She then moves on to say, and this is where I started writing things in the margin of this essay. She starts talking about literary fiction, or litfic, and she says quite categorically here, litfic thus does not teach any models of how the world changes or how history works other than the powerlessness model of the individual being ground by progress. And my comment, I wrote, this is a sweeping generalization. While I can't think of any exceptions, because my knowledge of literary fiction is insufficient, I find it hard to believe that no literary fiction does this, or that it is inherently incapable of doing this. Just sounds so unlikely to me. I'm sure there's some literary fiction that deals with change and doesn't just focus on the powerlessness model of the individual being ground by progress. I'm sure there must be. And your example of somebody falling down a well, it could be a story that teaches us moral lessons. It could be a story which provokes us to examine our own motivations. And so that's not just about the powerlessness of the individual. That is about other aspects of philosophy, sociology, which you mentioned earlier, and so on and so on.
Anytime the words every, all, or none are used,
Yeah.
I think that those maybe they're used to try and make a point to say,
Yes.
because we don't have a great word to say 99%,
No.
right? That's bigger than most.
Hmm.
It's too much work to say almost all again and again.
Yeah. And if you start hedging your bets, then people accuse you of using weasel words. So, yeah, I understand that. I just wish it weren't so full of generalizations.
All, none.
Yeah. It also does a thing which you go looking for examples and counter examples to an idea. And all the things that you like, you end up putting in your proof of the idea. And all the things that you disapprove of, you start using that as evidence against the thing. So, for example, she says, when literary authors want to talk about characters changing the world, they reach for the tools of SFF or historical fiction. And she mentions Margaret Atwood and various other authors. And that's also the same bit of the essay where she puts together in the same sentence for the first time SFF and historical fiction. So she doesn't argue that SFF and historical fiction are the same. She just passingly mentions them in the same breath, almost as if she hopes you don't notice that she's done this. So it's suddenly conflating two genres, which may well have a lot in common. And I would be very sympathetic to an essay that argued that science fiction is historical fiction. I'd be very happy to see an argument along those lines. But she doesn't argue that. She merely presents it in passing, unquestioningly. So I began to lose confidence in the argument at this point, which is a
Mm.
shame.
I think the analogy that she's trying to draw is dead spot on for good
Yes.
world building. But
Yes.
then it's the absolute inclusion to say that this must be this and all
Yeah.
people are this. Yeah, there are worlds of difference between the worlds of, say, Louis L'Amour and Joss Whedon's Firefly. Both are unquestionably Westerns,
Yeah.
but they're
Yeah.
pretty significantly different from one another.
Yeah. It's a good one. There's one more bit that I was quite taken with. Oh, she's actually quoting Ursula Le Guin. She says, Le Guin called genre writers realists of a larger reality. There is a sense in which a lot of science fiction does strive to be realistic, but of course it's not realistic because it's set in a world that's very different from our real world most of the time. So to call science fiction writers realists of a larger reality, I think is really nice.
If authors are the realists of a larger reality,
Yeah.
how would you describe the readers or experiencers of science fiction?
Oh,
Are we the explorers of a larger reality?
could be.
Or the consumers of a larger reality? Not liking that one so much.
It's closer to the reality, though, isn't it? Because we just consume it. We think that we're exploring it, but we're not. It's the writers who are doing the exploring. We're just, what's the word? We're fellow travelers.
Journeying into a larger reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, had a side thought. So, massively online role playing games.
Oh, yeah.
In those cases, and they're almost exclusively science fiction and fantasy based, you are the explorers of a larger reality.
Yes.
There are plots and stories that you are supposed to go through, but there's no one's feeding it to you. You have to be engaged in it and develop it.
Yeah. The online world has to be massive enough that you can wander around and still not feel that you've reached the edges. But yeah, I absolutely take your point on that. Yeah. So what about this other article that you brought up, which is David Brin's, actually it's a short story, isn't it? A
It
professor
is.
at Harvard. What was your thinking on this one?
So David Brin presented this on his blog saying, here's a little something to bring you some hope in today's world. And it's republishing a short story he had published quite a while ago. It's available in one of his short story collections. David Brin was one of my early science fiction reads because he wrote a story that includes my hometown in it. So if you read The Postman, it's got Cottage Grove, Oregon, where I grew up. First 18 years of my life. And so it's been fun finding him online and watching him on social media and seeing how his writing has changed and how he continues to write over the years. But he gives us this short story, and given the essay, I thought it was really applicable because it's about someone who is doing historical research and finding parallels between the movements of people I believe it was 1588. I didn't take good notes, so you might have to do a little bit more driving than I can. And as I'm reading through this, I'm wondering, oh, this is very historical. I'm kind of interested. Oh, I don't know enough about the history myself to know what's going on. But then these connections started aligning in really weird ways. It's like, so Galileo got free? That's incredible. I thought he died in captivity. And then you get to the end of the story, and now we're in the realm of science fiction for sure.
Yeah. It's an interesting one because it starts off, well, you assume, unless you're going to fact check everything in the story, you start off as you read it, you assume that it's all factually, historically correct at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You're very aware when you get to the end, or at least I think most readers will be aware, that we are no longer in the real world. We're in some sort of alternate history now. But what you're not aware of is, when did I flip over from one to the other? And
Yeah.
this is exactly the same phenomenon that happens in Robert J. Sawyer's novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, where he presents the life of Robert Oppenheimer with historical accuracy. And by the end of the book, you're in science fiction territory and you don't notice when you've shifted from the one to the other. It's an incredible skill, I think, for a writer to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But if we're looking for proof that science fiction writers can be historians, I think this story absolutely demonstrates it. And so does Sawyer's Oppenheimer Alternative. But were there any parts of the story as you were reading it that made you think, oh, hang on, this can't be true? I mean, was it only at the end when you got to the Galileo stuff, or was it happening earlier for you?
It was only at the end.
Interesting.
I didn't study history closely growing up, and I don't tend to read a lot of history. Reading this kind of makes me want to.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the famous scientists of the time. Although
yes.
even an understanding of the lives of the famous scientists would not have prepared me for every claim that our fictional historian is making as he writes his letter.
Yeah. There were certain bits that made me think, I bet that's not true. So I deliberately didn't look anything up as I was reading. I wanted to read all the way through the story and then go and check things. Mm. So I did start looking at which parts of it were true. And I'm just going to try and find my notes. Where does that come in? Oh, yeah. There's a bit where he's talking about the year 1629. And he's talking about this character, Henry Stevens, who's a kind of a common character, runs all the way through the story pretty much. He says, this led to what was heretofore his principal claim for historical notice as architect who laid down the basic plan for Boston town. So he's talking about this Henry Stevens as being the architect of Boston. So I went and looked that up. No, the actual architect of Boston was Charles Bulfinch. So that's the first part of the story that, for me, proved to be not historically true. Now, there may be other historically untrue things earlier on as well, because the whole thing is like a tall story in a way. But it's interesting that you can go so far through it and you reach something that you think, I bet that's not true. And then they begin to mount up. And I'll tell you, my problem with the story is that I don't know anywhere near enough, it turns out, about American history for many of these things to set any bells ringing. You know, most of it is just, oh, I didn't know that, didn't know that, didn't know that. And whether the claims are true claims or false claims, I didn't know either way. You know, there's another one I looked up. Oh, there was some discussion of this Roger Williams, and I looked that up, and that bit turned out to be true, the things he was saying about Roger Williams. He gets to another bit where he talks about, as you mentioned, Galileo being freed from house arrest in Italy and being brought to the US. And the story says, it astonishes me that no one has commented until now on the resemblance between Harvard's earliest professor of natural philosophy and the scholar who we are told died quietly under house arrest. So he's basically saying that the painting on the wall of that man with a beard looks remarkably like Galileo. So I thought, I wonder if that's true. So I looked it up. And no, Harvard's earliest professor of natural philosophy was a person called Isaac Greenwood. He doesn't look anything like Galileo, and he doesn't have a beard. So that is completely made up. But this is the beauty of this story. It's got some things in that are true, some that are false. Some of them are outrageously false, but you believe them because of the way it's presented. And I just think that's terrific. I love it.
Yeah, the gift of the storyteller. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so embedding all this history and fake history and done so seamlessly is a work of art for sure.
Yes. He puts a little addendum in for 2026. So
Mm.
I, not part of the story, but something that he's added for the blog post. And he's referring to things in the American Civil War. And again, that's one of those areas where I don't know nearly enough about the subject. So I get the gist of what he's saying in that addendum, but not as much as I imagine you would get, or any American reading this would get. But what I did take from it is how accurate a lot of the history of science stuff is, because that is something that I've studied. And so all the stuff about Galileo, apart from him being broken out of jail and brought to the US, everything in there seems right. And the stuff about Torricelli seems to be right. But it's got this, what's the word? Truthiness. It's got truthiness about it.
Yeah. So the comment about the Civil War is it's a political statement about the people currently in power in the United States and their values versus the values that have been worked so hard on between here and the Civil War.
That's what I assumed. But anyway, the story I think stands on its own terms. And it's a very good illustration of how a science fiction writer can be a historian and vice versa.
Yeah. I thought a lot about, I read a lot of Brandon Sanderson, and so I thought a lot about how this applies to his laws of magic. One of those being that if magic exists, then society and history and development will build itself around it.
Mm.
And he's the person who's writing that, so he can make that come true. So if you look at his primary fantasy series, he's actually advancing technology along with magic. One of the things in his magic system is if you have the magic, you can attract or reject metal, which can be used offensively. You can shoot metal at people. It can be used defensively. You can push arrows away from you. Fast forward 150 years. People have built a rudimentary engine using that magic. And so trains are being propelled along tracks using that magic. So yeah, he's making this postulation that magic isn't the rare arcane thing that we've read in epic Western fantasy. It can be a very different thing. And it's an interesting take on it. But again, he's using the tenets of history about the evolution of things. And yeah.
It's sort of straddling science fiction and fantasy. It is fantasy, but it's using the methods of science fiction to convince you that this world is a viable world. Whereas not all fantasy will do that. Some fantasy doesn't care at all about science or realism. And so that's partly why I get a bit uncomfortable when people bundle together science fiction and fantasy, because I think the agenda of science fiction can be very different to the agenda of fantasy. Sometimes they are similar and come very, very close to each other, as with Brandon Sanderson. But sometimes they are diametrically opposed from each other. So making sweeping generalizations about what SFF writers do is going too far, in my view.
There are so many of them. How could you possibly be right about all of them at once?
There is also good science fiction and there is bad science fiction. There is good fantasy and there is bad fantasy. And something I'm acutely aware of, if you go to a science fiction, an academic conference in science fiction, everybody is always talking about good science fiction. They're never using crappy pieces of work that later on I'm going to mention again, The Time Tunnel, which has some terrible science fiction in it. Nobody is going to stand up in a conference and present a thesis based on Time Tunnel because some of it is terrible. I mean, it might be good television, but it's not great science fiction. Nobody's doing that. They're cherry picking the bits of science fiction that work really well, and then they're presenting arguments based on that. And I often think that if you're going to make a generalization, it's got to work for all of it. It's got to work for the good stuff. It's also got to work for the rubbish.
Yeah. Unless that's why the rubbish fails.
Okay.
But then we'd have to come up with some word for what the rubbish science fiction actually is if it isn't.
Yes, that's
right. Yeah. Let's not go there. Let us move on to a quiz.
Okay.
So this quiz comes from Damo McQuillick, and he is Irish, and he has made us a science fiction quiz and a half. There are 14 questions,
Hmm.
and let me read you the structure of the quiz. This is Damo's ultra hard or tediously obscure science fiction quiz. Each question is a phrase or two in a language other than English, and they're all real languages. There's no invented languages here. They're taken from novels which are all written originally in English by an English writer.
Right.
The phrase in the clue is one that is very important to the story. And he makes a passing example here. The phrase Auf Wiedersehen will not be used because German characters say that all the time, and it isn't specific enough to help you find the work.
Right. Okay.
Let me give you an easy one to start with.
Please.
Yeah.
Okay.
The clue is Soma.
Soma. Now, I think that's a clue to Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
That is exactly right.
Phew. So this is a doable quiz.
Now, what was Soma, really quick, for people that may not have read the book yet?
To be honest, I can't quite remember. Is it a drug?
It is a drug.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's the drug that pacifies society to help keep them compliant and
Right.
tractable.
Yeah.
All right. The next one is Schlachthof 5.
Ooh.
That's Schlachthof 5.
Now, I do know a little bit of German, and I know that fünf is 5. I think Hof is like a shelter or something. So you have a Bahnhof, which is a station for trains.
Yes.
Schlacht, I'm not sure. But I'm going to make a guess, simply because that's German. I'm going to guess it might be Slaughterhouse 5.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Does it actually mean Slaughterhouse 5?
Yeah, this is the German name for the abattoir in which Billy Pilgrim hides from the firebombing of Dresden.
Fantastic.
Okay. The next one is Ikvan Bedouin. That's Ikvan Bedouin.
Okay.
And I have a series of hints which you can ask for.
The only thing I would say is that that second word reminds me of Bedouin. So people who travel across the desert with camel trains, that sort of thing. But what it would mean, I don't know. Deserts make me think of Dune by Frank Herbert, but I don't know if that's got anything to do with it. So yeah, give me a clue.
Well, actually, you've come up with the first clue. This is an essentially Arabic phrase which means Brotherhood of the Bedouin.
Oh, okay.
I would encourage you to go with your gut instincts.
Well, I'm going to say this is from Frank Herbert's Dune.
That's exactly right. They're essentially talking about what group of people from Dune.
What group of people? I can't remember what the groups of people are called.
The Fremen.
Oh, okay. Didn't remember that at all.
Yeah, the people in the desert who Paul is their savior. So they
Okay.
are the Ikvan Bedouin. Okay. Third one is Wu Löwenzahn. So unfortunately, all of my foreign language recognition ends up sounding like German or Spanish, or a mishmash of the two. But this one is Wu Löwenzahn.
Löwenzahn. Löwen is lion or lions. Zahn is tooth. So this is, I don't know what woo is. Woo? Woo?
It's Wu,
Löwenzahn.
definitely Wu.
Woo. Woo Löwenzahn. Lion tooth. No, I can't get it from that.
So you've deconstructed the German exactly. Löwenzahn is the German for dandelion, and Wu is actually a separate language. It's Chinese or Japanese.
This is going to be my wild guess, inspired by that knowledge. Is it anything to do with Man in the High Castle?
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Good job. Yeah, Wu is a concept in the Chinese and Japanese folk religion referring to awareness, consciousness, or enlightenment. And in the book, Operation Löwenzahn is the German plan to attack the Japanese home islands with nuclear missiles.
Very good.
So you're doing great. You're 4 for 4.
Wow.
All right. Question 4 is Buddha-yin. That's Buddha-yin.
Buddha-yin. It's not ringing any bells. Buddha? But I can't get any further with that. Any clues?
The first clue is that this is an Arabic word meaning an old city center area, often a slum.
Yeah, I'm stumped.
Okay, the second clue is Buddha-yin, a cyberpunk novel with an Arabic heart.
Cyberpunk novel with an Arabic heart. The only cyberpunk novel that I can remember the title of is Neuromancer.
No, this is actually When Gravity Fails by George Alec Effinger.
I've read some of him, yeah.
So the Budayin is the name of the lawless inner city area of the city where the book is set.
Okay.
Let's move on to number 5. Viriditas. Viriditas.
I have no idea on the meaning. It reminds me a bit of Viriconium. M. John Harrison, I think.
No. Let me give you the first clue.
Yes, please.
So this is a Latin word meaning greenness and fertility.
Then I am going to leap to Green Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson.
That's right.
Whoa!
Yes.
It was either going to be that or The Green Hills of Earth by Robert Heinlein.
That phrase is used throughout the Mars trilogy, and it means vitality, fecundity, lushness, verdure, or growth. And it's the philosophy of those people that want to terraform Mars.
So I probably have come across that then. I've read the first of those books. So if it comes up in volume 1, then yeah, I will have seen it.
Number 6, Kraken. Not the John Wyndham novel.
Is it spelled the same way? Kraken?
Yes. Oregonians would say Kraken, but it's actually Kraken.
And we're talking book, are we?
Yes, it's a phrase from a book.
No, I need more clue.
The author's first name is a country, but not the country from which Kraken comes from.
First name is a country. Trying to think of authors with countries for a first name. France, Germany. I need more clues.
The book is set in London, like many of this writer's best works.
China Mieville. So the question is which book? I'm going to guess The City and the City.
This book is just Kraken.
Oh, I see. That is the actual title of the book.
For this particular one, yes. I'm willing to give you full marks because you got to China Mieville. So, question 7 is the word Pax. P-A-X.
I've seen that in various places. It's a historical term. I think it literally means peace. In history, there was the Pax Romana. But what book does this come from? Pax.
First hint, the title of the novel is from Greek and means signs or meaning.
Signs or meaning. From Greek. Logos, I think, is the Greek for sign. Or word, maybe. Is that anything to do with it?
No. Let me give you the next clue. This is a first contact novel.
First Contact. No, I can't get it.
This is Semiosis by Sue Burke.
I've heard of Semiosis, but not as a book. I didn't know it's the title of a book. Interesting.
Yeah. And Pax is the name of the planet settled by humans in the novel.
Okay. That sounds like a novel that I ought to read.
It does. I like a first contact novel. Number 8 is, I'm going to try and say this. I will fail because it's French. La Belle Époque.
La Belle Époque is literally beautiful epoch, beautiful era, wonderful times. I think historically it probably refers to a particular period in history, but what this has got to do with science fiction, I do not know, so I need a clue.
Well, you're right there. The meaning of the phrase in the novel is very close to the meaning in which this phrase is understood in French and wider European history. So keep going down that path and think along those lines.
I don't know when that period was. I'm guessing it was late 19th century, but I don't know. What would this be from?
This book is from your area of the woods.
It's not the title of a book.
No, it's from a phrase in the book.
So it's a British novel?
It is the best well-known Welsh science fiction writer and one of Damo's favorite authors.
Welsh science fiction writer. I've gone totally blank on Welsh science fiction writers. I can't think of any.
It's actually from a pair of novels. Maybe one is a sequel to the other.
No, I'm stumped.
The author is Alastair Reynolds, and the books are Chasm City and Revelation Space.
Okay. It's another writer that I haven't read any of. I really must one day.
This next phrase, I will try to pronounce it. I believe it's Portuguese. Capoeira capoeirista.
Capoeira capoeirista.
Capoeira capoeirista. I'm going to give you the first hint right off the bat.
Please.
It's Portuguese.
Yeah.
And it is from the country, which is the title of the book in question.
It's from the country, which is the title of the book in question. And presumably, the country is not Portugal, because that's too obvious. It therefore might be Brazil. Is there a book called Brazil?
Yes. This is Brazil by Ian MacDonald. Capoeira is an African Brazilian martial art and game which includes elements of dance, acrobatics, music, and spirituality.
Very good.
Next one is Okwu.
Okwu. How are you spelling that?
OKWU.
Okwu. I'm not familiar with the word. My instinct is that it might be something like an African word, like a Swahili word or Nigerian or something like that.
It's the Himba language of Namibia.
Namibia. So, where does that get me? Is this a work of Afrofuturism?
Yes.
So now I have to start thinking of writers of such works, and my first thought is Nnedi Okorafor. Is that anywhere close?
Yes, this comes from the Binti books by Nnedi Okorafor.
I'm so glad you interrupted me and said the title, because I couldn't think of the title.
So Okwu is the name of a character in the book, and the word means speech.
Okay.
Moving on. This next one is geometry.
Geometry. So it's geometry, but with an S.
Yes.
Geometry. No, it doesn't do anything for me, so I need a clue on this one.
The clue is this isn't a real word, but it comes from a real Greek word and a real Arabic word.
Real Greek and real Arabic. When it comes to sort of made up things, I start thinking of Terry Pratchett. Has it got anything to do with him?
No, let me give you the next clue, which may help. This is a trilogy, which is one of the most notable Hugo successes of all time.
Oh my goodness, and I don't know it.
You know the author?
Did you say most successful trilogy
Yes, I did.
of all time?
Hugo trilogy of all time.
Hugo's most successful Hugo trilogy.
But most notable Hugo, maybe not most successful.
Most notable Hugo winning trilogy. Any more clues?
No, that was the second and last hint.
Okay. What sort of time period are we talking about? Is this like in the 2010s or?
2010s.
I'm stumped.
This is the Broken Earth trilogy from N.K. Jemisin.
Okay.
I haven't read these. I think I own 2 of the books, but they're on the to-do list.
Yeah.
And the word geometry is a discipline combining geology with chemistry and other physical sciences.
Very good.
Number 12, and there's only 2 left, so you're almost through.
Okay.
The words karma and Atman.
Karma and Atman.
Karma and Atman.
I don't know what language karma comes from. Obviously, we have that word in English, but it comes from somewhere else. I assume it's sort of Far Eastern, but I don't know.
Yeah, Sanskrit words, and Atman means soul.
Sanskrit. So which writers would use Sanskrit? I'm going to fall back on Arthur C. Clarke and see if that works.
No.
Don't know.
Have you read much Zelazny?
I've read a little Zelazny and didn't enjoy it. So.
This comes from his book Lord of Light, and they're Hindu concepts, and Atman refers to the souls of the characters in the story.
Okay.
Last question.
Woohoo.
Triumvir Svinoi. That's Triumvir Svinoi.
Russian?
It is. Triumvir is Latin.
Triumvirate? Trio?
Triumvir means 3 rulers, one of 3 rulers in Latin.
One of 3 rulers.
Despite the words coming from Latin and Russian, the major language used in this book is Canasian, which is Franco-Mandarin.
Franco-Mandarin. This is going to be something I've never read, and probably an author that I've never read.
It might be an author we mentioned earlier in the quiz.
In the quiz. China Mieville.
Alastair Reynolds. And the novel is Revelation Space.
Okay, yeah.
So the interstellar spacecraft Nostalgia for Infinity is governed by 3 people, including main character Ilya Volyova, who rather pompously call themselves a triumvirate.
Very good.
Damo, thank you very much for this. I have to confess, I was a little bit worried about giving this to Phil, but yeah. I think you got at least 3/4 of them, which is pretty impressive.
I'm surprised, but most of them I got because of linguistics rather than any knowledge of science fiction. Well, linguistics got me to a point where I could speculate on what the science fiction work was, and then I was limited to my own knowledge of books and authors. So I just struck lucky in a couple of places. But thank you, Damo. That was fun.
Yeah.
Should we do past, present, and future items?
Yes.
This is my past item. I've mentioned it a couple of times in today's episode. I've been rewatching The Time Tunnel on Blu-ray. It's a 1966 TV series. I saw it in the 70s when it was shown on British TV, and I was a young kid. I used to come home from school on a Thursday, and Time Tunnel would be on. Hooray!
Yeah.
And I used to love it. Every now and again, I've watched old episodes, but I got the Blu-ray set and started watching them in order from episode 1. And the first one's good. Second one really stinks. The third one, I think, really stinks. And then the fourth one is good. So I think I've seen 4 episodes so far, and it's got a success rate of about 50%. And the bad ones are terribly bad. The worst science in any TV show I've ever seen. We're talking about opposite masses attracting in one episode. What? What are you talking about? There's no such thing as an opposite mass. And even if there were, all masses attract.
Yeah, opposite charges, maybe.
Yes. There's an episode where our time-traveling heroes land in 1910, and there's a mining disaster that they get caught up in, and they try and get people to rescue people from the mine, but nobody's interested in rescuing them because they think the world is going to end because Halley's Comet, as they call it, Halley's Comet, is in the sky. Today we tend to say Halley's Comet.
Yeah.
So they call it Halley's Comet, and everyone's convinced it's going to destroy the Earth. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, even as a child, I knew that Halley's Comet came back every 75 years or so and was never going to collide with the Earth. And the whole point about Halley's Comet is that it just keeps coming back and does us no harm. So, yeah, the Time Tunnel, not bad entertainment for its time, but it's no Star Trek, that's for sure. Anyway, that's my recommendation. Is everyone should go and watch Time Tunnel to see how bad science fiction can be.
I have a past item. So there is a 130-year-old film by Georges Méliès depicting an automaton being restored by the Library of Congress. And the thrust of the film is a fear of technology and being replaced by robots. And that's very applicable for today. And so it's something that we've been engaged with as a society now for 130 years.
That's interesting. I've got a present item, but I'm going to fling it over to you, because the present item is simply that I've noticed that Project Hail Mary is on general release in cinemas worldwide and seems to be getting some good press. I haven't seen it, but I think you might have done. Is it any good?
Oh, yeah. I want to say 2 things about it. One, it is a good movie.
Right.
But I had some absolutely horrible things happen to me the weekend before I watched it. So I came out of the movie with this sense of there's just something off about it I don't get. And I think I was just bringing all this burden into the movie with me. And tonight I'm going to fix that problem by going to see it again for my son's 25th birthday. So Tim wants to see it on IMAX. So we're going to go see it again tonight. It's canonical. It's delightful. It's Project Hail Mary in film mode. There's not time to make a completely canonical adaptation of a multi-hundred word book, but it's all there.
That's good to know. There was a podcast episode recently where the screenwriter talks about his process, and it's very interesting that he basically doesn't sit down with the book and try to capture the structure of the book. It's more that as he's reading, he thinks, oh, that's an interesting bit, and he writes it down, and he just writes down the interesting moments. He's not looking at structure at that point. He's just harvesting things that would be interesting to see in a movie. And then, having written down that list of things, he then thinks about, well, how do I tell the story now with these bits? So as an adaptation process, it's not what you think, really.
Yeah.
And given that, I think it's miraculous if it has come out anything like the book, because you wouldn't have thought it would.
Yeah, I guess it'd be like saying, what are the best parts of a hamburger?
Yeah.
And, ending up with something you could get down the street at McDonald's by saying, oh, the best part of the hamburger is the salad part with some meat in it. Yeah. Getting it in a bowl with some bread on the side.
Yeah.
Boy, I could talk about present items for a while, but let me cherry pick some of the best ones. So the process of recovering lost episodes from Doctor Who is continuing. So there are now 2 more from the 3rd season from the beginning of the Daleks Master Plan arc of stories. So that's cool. I'm still hoping that we can get more of them as time goes by, but the longer time goes, the harder it is to find those things. So maybe we'll see them, maybe we won't.
Yeah.
And the actors from the television show Firefly have announced not an adaptation, not a sequel, but that they're going to make animated versions of the stories from between the time the series ended and the movie happened, which bookends the entire story arc. Every actor is on board for this. Joss Whedon is on board for this. They have a studio. What they need to know is there's enough popularity from people to say that, yes, it's worth investing money into.
Very good. Shall I throw in a future item?
Sure.
It's my perpetual future item for all mankind. Season 5 starts soon, but Apple have announced that there will be a Season 6, and that will also be the last season. And I gather there's also going to be a spin-off series from it called Star City, which from the title I assume is going to be set in Russia and the Soviet Union, as was.
It makes me wonder, if this continues, what would you do after Star City? There must be a Chinese version of this,
Yeah.
My future one is an annual one now, and that is the OMSI Science Fiction Film Festival here in Portland. So it launches in just a few weeks, April 10th, and it will open with The Matrix on that gigantic screen, and I'm so excited. There are some new ones I want to see. I want to rewatch some old ones that I enjoy watching. Notable from that, for my other podcast, Take Me to Your Reader, someone has requested that we do Solaris from the book by Stanislav Lem. There were at least 2 adaptations, the older of which is going to be part of the film festival, and then we'll just catch the George Clooney remake and then do a podcast about it.
You've never done Solaris? I thought you had.
No,
Well, I'm out of stuff now. Have you got anything else?
I don't think so. And if so, I'll talk about it next month.
Okay, that's it then. Let's close there.
Okay. Thanks for listening.
We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kusky.
Our music is from Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com.
Please visit our website at 101sf.blogspot.com.
where you can support us by buying us a coffee.
And you can find us on Facebook and Blue Sky. So see you next time.